Meet Sarah, your typical San Diego rental property owner, owns a rental property for the last few years, has a tenant in place, been there about 2.5 years. She hasn't raised rent recently, so she decided to increase the rent 10%. Let the tenant know. 2 weeks later, she got a demand letter from an attorney for thousands of dollars to drop a case against her for violating a local rent control ordinance. This is a very common example. I've managed over 1,500 rental properties. I've heard all sorts of stories of people getting taken advantage of because they don't understand these complex laws in California, specifically around rent control. So if you own a rental property in California, you can't afford to make a similar mistake. So I'm gonna break down rent control at a very basic level, what it is, how it affects you, what you need to know to navigate the rent control laws without giving you a 401 huge discourse on it. I'm just gonna give you the basics so that you can stay compliant and protect your rental investment. My name is Steve Welty. I'm CEO of Good Life Property Management. We're on a mission to make owning a rental property easy. So what is rent control and does it apply to you? So rent control covers essentially two main things. Number one is how much you can raise rent, and two, if and when and how you can give your tenant notice to vacate. In California, the primary law that was passed to enact rent control statewide is called AB 1482. However, many local cities have their own rent control ordinances, so you need to know not only the state law, but also check with your local city. So does rent control apply to your rental property? So let's go down the checklist. Number one, it does not apply to single family homes and condos. It does apply to most multifamily properties, 2 units or above, that were built after 2005. If your property is corporate owned in an LLC that's owned by a corporation, not just a single member or like a person, then it also usually falls under rent control. Now again, some cities have stricter rent control legislation like San Francisco, LA, so you have to know your local ordinance. Now single family homeowners, before you just leave this video, I encourage you to stick around and learn more because this may be coming your way. We narrowly avoided this rent control applying to single family homes and condos through the last election in Prop 33, I believe it was. And luckily the voters came out and defeated it, both landlords and tenants. And so we're safe for now, but in the future, they're gonna continue to keep coming. So it's important to know about how this works and then know what you can do to protect your investment. All right, so exemptions from rent control in summary. Again, single family homes and condos, properties that are younger than 15 years old, and then owner-occupied duplexes are also exempt from rent control. All right, so now we know a little bit about who rent control applies to. Now let's talk about how do you raise rent if you are under rent control. So there are very strict rules under AB 1482. Basically, you can raise rent 5% annually plus CPI, so the Consumer Price Index. And you have to look up the CPI for your specific locality. So there's websites where you can pull it, and that's where Sarah got into trouble. Sarah thought she had heard through the grapevine that you can always raise rent a max 10%, but inflation went down. It was, let's say 2.5%. So it's 5 plus 2.5%, 7.5%. So that's why it's important to know these laws. Now, local rent control can be stricter. In Santa Ana, for example, it's usually around 3%, areas of San Francisco and LA. So make sure you understand your local rent control laws. All right, so how do you legally raise rent on a rent controlled property? So this one's pretty easy. You always need to give a 30 days notice and you can't exceed that maximum amount I just discussed. Now for non-rent controlled properties, you can raise more than 10%, but you have to give a 90-day notice. So what must be included on the notice? You need to include the dollar amount of the increase, the percentage increase that equates to, the effective date, and then if it's in a non-rent controlled area or it's a non-rent controlled building, a disclosure saying how it's exempt from rent control. And there's only certain ways you can actually deliver this notice legally. It has to be personally served to the tenant, substitute service to an adult age person at the property, or what's known as post and mail, where you nail it on the door. No, you just post it with tape and then send a copy in the mail. All right, so now how do you give a tenant notice to vacate or evict a tenant when it's under rent control? So under AB 1482, once a tenant's lived there for at least 12 months, they're protected under just cause eviction protections, which basically means you need to have one of a few approved reasons to give them notice to vacate, and it depends. It breaks into 2 categories. So at fault reasons to evict would be like if the tenant's not paying the rent, if they're substantially violating the lease, they're not letting you into the property to inspect the property, or they're just being a nuisance to the neighborhood. You better have a very clear, well-documented, provable case if you're gonna evict in California, and so make sure to keep very good documentation. So no fault eviction reasons usually include an owner or a relative wants to move back in, you plan to substantially remodel the property, you plan to withdraw the property from the rental market, which actually is protected by a law known as the Ellis Act. That's right, we had to actually pass a law to keep the right to not have to rent our property, but that's actually been under attack by some legislatures that want to force people, I guess, to rent their property long term, or if there was some sort of government order. So here's the key thing to know. If it's a no fault reason, you're gonna have to pay a relocation expense to your tenant. But make sure to check your local rent control laws, because some cities have upped that to 2 months rent, 3 months rent, up to 4 months rent in some cases for relocation assistance for a no fault reason. The other thing to know with remodeling the property, you actually have to have permits in hand before you can give notice, and it has to be a substantial remodel. So no trying to get around that by just like saying you're gonna do a little bit of work. They actually make you prove it. And if you're doing one of those notices, I highly recommend you work with a professional property manager or an attorney to help you navigate that. All right, so navigating rent control laws can feel restrictive, and it is, but you can set proactive strategies in place to help you navigate the complexity. So one of the best ways to protect yourself as a landlord is to consider annual rent increases. Yes, that's right. This is one of the unintended consequences of the rent control laws that are designed to protect the tenant. About half of my clients usually would opt to not raise the rent or raise it very little every year just because they like to keep it easy. But now with rent control laws limiting how much you can raise rent, they are now almost always increasing the rent, keeping the rents more competitive and making rents higher for everyone. But it's just too risky for you to risk falling behind and not being able to catch up. Be smart with your rent increases though. The dynamics of the market are always changing, and there's nothing worse than offering a too high of a rent increase and you get a vacancy and then you can't even rent it at that rate. So make sure your offer makes sense. I like to set the rent a little bit competitive to what it would be in the market. That way the tenant gets a little better deal, you don't get a vacancy, they look out in the market and they see they can't get a better deal. Sometimes if it's been a longer term tenant too, you can offer some sort of just perk or upgrade, like a carpet cleaning or a painting of a bedroom or something, just to create a win-win for both you and the tenant. Another strategy you can use is just offering a longer term lease renewal. It's always great to try them out for the first year, but if it makes sense, then you can offer a longer term 2-3 year lease renewals, a lot of times at a lower rate, because if they're gonna lock in and you're not gonna get a vacancy, then you're gonna save money over time, the tenant can win, and so there's different strategies you can use to keep more money in your pocket. If you're a landlord in California, staying compliant on the laws is key. I encourage you to watch my video on lessons learned from managing over 1,500 rental properties. I hope you can get some tips and learn from lessons that I've learned the hard way so you can save time and make more money. I'm Steve Welty, CEO of Good Life Property Management. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.